Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I'm your hard-working but indefatigable teacher, Mr. Burton. You will need to watch this video and take notes as you go. You may need to watch certain parts of the video a few times to ensure complete understanding. This is your homework and I will check your notes tomorrow before we get started. I hope you learned something.
Okay, welcome to today's lesson, and this is a supply topic. In this topic, we're looking at firms and the goods and services they supply to the market.
Intuitively, the analysis of supply is very much like the analysis of demand. Really, it's just looking at the flip side of the same coin. Let's look back at the key points of demand and then turn those concepts around to apply them to the seller instead of the buyer. Remember the law of demand? Buyers like low prices and dislike high prices, other things being equal? Well, what would a law of supply look like? Think about it. What do sellers like better, low prices or high prices? Sellers prefer higher prices. That is when they're happier to provide their product or service to the market. So the law of supply might be something like, more of a good will be provided the higher its price, less will be provided the lower its price, ceteris paribus. This law of supply makes perfect sense, saying that there is a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Of course, at lower prices, suppliers are either unable, they can't cover their costs, or unwilling, not enough profit motive, to provide much product. But at higher prices, the suppliers make a lot more profit, other things remaining equal, and are much happier to provide the product to the market. Okay, think back to demand again. What factors or variables affect willingness to purchase? Quantity demanded is affected by product price, price of substitutes, price of complements, income, tastes, age, weather, and so on. Well, guess what? Suppliers' decisions are affected by much more than the price tag, too. Like what? Well, good question. What determines a supplier's willingness or ability to provide the product to the market? Price of the product, certainly, but more important is profitability, which is determined not only by product price, but also by cost of production, such as wages or cost of labor, rent or cost of capital, cost of raw materials or natural resources. What about other costs besides the resources? Taxes, paperwork, licensing? In some businesses, you have to pass exams or be subject to periodic audit or accreditation. These are all costs. What about variables that affect your ability to produce? Worker strikes, natural disasters, shipping disruptions. Inability to get your resources results in an inability to produce, decreasing the amount provided to the market. On the other hand, better technology or worker productivity would be examples of variables that would enhance production, making more product available. What else? Expectations affect supply. Heck, even weather affects supply. Ultimately, quantity supplied is a function of all these things: price, wages, taxes, technology, weather. Just remember, I only like to look at two things at any given time so that I can draw the relationship. In this case, price and quantity supplied. Going back to our housing example, at a price of $100 per square foot, and considering wages for carpenters, roofers, electricians, plumbers, lumber, copper, permits and fees, expectations of home sales, etc., quantity supplied 1 will be provided. But if price goes to $200 per square foot, all else staying the same, more houses will be provided. There are an infinite number of other prices and associated quantities supplied, so the supply line is a collection of all price quantity supplied combinations. Just as with demand, a change in price will not change the supply, but rather move along the supply curve, resulting in a change in the quantity supplied. Changing anything other than the product price will alter the underlying supply. For example, what if the government imposes a higher minimum wage? As wage increases from W1 to W2, the quantity demanded of labor, since the employer demands or purchases some amount of labor, decreases from L1 to L2. With less labor to work with, the supply of the end product decreases. Any cost increase makes business less profitable, which is a disincentive to produce. What would happen if costs fall? For example, if business taxes decrease or if technology gets cheaper? The bottom line is that you need to pay careful attention to the difference between a change in supply and a change in quantity supplied. Next time, equilibrium.
A great little video there, introductory video on our supply topic. Our definition for supply. This is the quantity of a good or service that a firm is willing and able to provide to the market. And we need to make a distinction between supply and quantity supplied. Quantity supplied is the amount of a good or a service that a business is willing and able to produce at a range of different prices. And just like we had a law of demand, we also have a law of supply. And this time, the law of supply states that as the price of a good or service increases, now the quantity supplied increases as well. And vice versa for a decrease in price. And again, this is assuming ceteris paribus, everything else remains equal. So with the law of supply, we're just interested in with changes in the price. That's the only variable we're looking at. Other things are assumed to be constant.
The law of supply is one of the most fundamental principles in microeconomics. According to the law of supply, for all other things remaining constant, the higher the price of a good or service, the higher the supply. Producers want to produce more of that good or service at the higher price to increase profits. Conversely, the lower the price, the lower the supply. If you were to graph this relationship with the quantity supplied on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis, the relationship between price and supply is graphed as an upward sloping curve from left to right. This line is referred to as a supply curve. Movement along the supply curve is referred to as supply expanding or contracting as price changes. Wesleya Corp produces electric cars. At a price of $20,000, Wesleya produces 5,000 cars. If the price increases to $25,000, Wesleya will produce 6,000 electric cars. The higher price induces them to build more cars. The law of supply is a theoretical concept. In real life, variables do not remain constant. Things other than price can affect supply, such as prices of related goods, availability, and price of raw materials.
The supply schedule, our definition, the table that shows the relationship between the price of goods or services and the quantity that's supplied across a range of prices. We're going to assume that there are 5 firms within this given market, and the table below, the supply schedule, shows the quantity supplied by each of these 5 firms at a range of different prices. So it looks very much like a demand schedule, doesn't it? Instead of consumer A, we've got producer A. Producers A, B, C, D, and E, the firms comprising the market. Now, if we sum how much each of these individual firms are going to supply the market at each different price, that will give us our market supply. So at $2 here, producer A is going to supply 70, producer B 90, producer C 60, producer D a whopping 200, producer E 80. And if we sum them all up, at $2, the market supply will be 500 units. So you remember just the market supply, the sum of all the supply of individual firms in the market for a good or service. Supply schedules. Very much like the demand schedule, range of prices. The supplier, individual supplier, in this case for A Inc., B Inc., how much they'll supply the market across a range of different prices. C Inc., D Incorporated, E. And once we sum each of these individual firms, how much they're supplying to the market at each individual price, we will determine the market supply schedule. So just setting across each different price, each firm, and there we have our market supply. Okay, and once we have that information, we have a market supply schedule. We can take that supply schedule and turn it into a supply curve, and that's just the graphical representation of the information contained in the supply curve. Now remember, supply is essentially all about profit. It's all about profit. So at low prices, supplying a good is relatively less profitable. Understandably, firms, entrepreneurs, etc. are less interested in supplying the market at low prices, where profits are likely to be far lower, and they're going to be much more interested in supplying at high prices, which is why, when prices increase, the quantity of goods supplied increased, the law of supply. Higher prices mean supplying a good is relatively more profitable. Related supply completely back to profitability. Now, this is because economics assumes that firms are motivated by profit. All things being equal, price increases lead to higher profits. Price decreases to lower profits. And we are assuming everything remains equal when we look at the price changes. Businesses are going to increase the quantity of supply for a good or service if the price increases and it becomes relatively more profitable. And they're going to do this, supply more, by shifting resources away from the production of other goods and services. So, for example, they're going to shift labour away from goods from goods B, C, and D if the price of good A increases, and that becomes relatively more profitable. And similarly, when prices decrease, the quantity supplied also decreases, as it's now relatively less profitable to produce and supply this good or service.
In the supply curve, we want to know the relationship between price and quantity supplied. Let's make it real simple by keeping everything else constant. That means ceteris paribus. Great. Only price and quantity left. As usual, we put the price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. As producers, we love profits like bees love honey. Since price increases revenue, increase in revenue, increase profits. The higher the price, the merrier. At $2, we'll supply 10 cakes, but at $4, whoa, higher price. Let's supply more cakes. Connect the dots. Ta-da! The supply curve. Note, it's upward sloping. When price increases, quantity supplied increases. When price decreases, quantity supplied decreases. The arrows are in the same direction. This is the law of supply. There's a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Ceteris paribus, given everything else constant. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe. Next up.
So we take our supply schedule, and this gives us the market supply. And all we're doing, price on the y-axis again, and quantity demanded, quantity supplied should be. And all we're doing is plotting the information in our market supply schedule. So the price of $1, 5 is the quantity supplied, $2, 10 is quantity supplied, and so on and so on until we've used up our range of prices. Link those together, we have our supply curve, and that's exactly how it's derived. On our supply curve, we can show what happens with the change in price. So here, $3, at the price of $3 P1, 15 is quantity supplied. At P2, price increases to $5, shown by an arrow and labeled with a new price there, P2. Quantity supplied increases from QS1 to QS2, and this time it's 25 is quantity supplied at the higher price. Same sort of thing with a price decrease. We can model this. So price 1 decreases from $3 to $1, P1 to P2, and the quantity supplied decreases from QS1 to QS2, labeled with arrows. So here we are. As price increases, quantity supplied increases, the law of supply, and this is shown as a movement along the supply curve. And conversely, as price decreases, then the quantity supplied decreases. And again, a movement along the demand curve. And just like there were various factors that would determine demand, there are factors
Let's
that determine
imagine
supply.
we're all producers and think like producers. We love profits like bees love honey. Revenue minus cost give us profit, so anything that increases profit will make us produce, produce, and produce. Money, money, money. First, prices. When price increases, revenue increases. Hence, profits increase. That's a signal to produce more. In other words, increase quantity supplied. Input prices. Suppose we bake and sell cakes. Eggs, flour, and labor all cost money. When price of inputs like eggs increases, baking cakes become less profitable. So, we'll supply fewer cakes. Technology. We used to bake with these. That's slow. Due to improvements in technology, we now bake with these. Our productivity increases. So better technology helps us save cost, which increases our profits. We'll gladly supply more cakes. Yum yum. Competitive supply. As bakers, we can bake cakes or bread. If price of bread increases, this means baking bread is more profitable. Then we should bake more bread? Crap. Supply of cakes has to decrease. Why? Because we use the same resources to bake bread and cakes. When we bake more bread, we have fewer resources left to bake cakes. In this case, we say that cakes and bread are in competitive supply. When supply of bread increases, supply of cakes has to decrease. There is another type of supply called joint supply. For example, beef and leather. To produce more beef, we have to slaughter more cows. This allows us to produce more leather too. So we say that beef and leather are in joint supply. When supply of beef increases, supply of leather increases as well. Expectation of future prices. Suppose you own some gold. If you think the price of gold is going to fall in the future, sell the gold as soon as possible before its price falls further. So supply of gold today will rise. If you think the price is going to rise in the future, then keep the gold today so that you can sell it at a higher profit in the future. So supply of gold today will fall. Weather. Remember the tsunami that hit Japan in 2011? That destroyed many factories. So supply of many stuff like cars and electronics decreased in the short term. And of course, with good weather, supply increases. Number of producers. In 2010, if you wanted a tablet, you had to get an iPad. As more manufacturers entered the tablet market, you have many choices today. When number of producers increases, supply increases, and vice versa. So this is the summary. But hey, there are so many factors affecting supply. How do I graph the supply curve? If you like this video,
Okay, determinants of supply. So the supply curve itself can shift left, indicating decreased supply, or it can shift right, and it's increased supply. If we have a look at the figure right, there are 6 factors that determine supply, and thus increase or decrease supply are cost of production, productivity, price of related goods, climate and natural disasters, the profitability of industries, how much tax is placed on the good or service, and whether or not it is subsidized or not. We'll have a look at each of these quickly in turn. Remember, supply is all about profitability, and cost of production will determine a firm's profitability as well as the price. So profit is the cost to make the good subtracted from the final selling price. So these are costs related to making or acquiring goods and services that directly generates revenue for a firm. Increases in the price of factors of production are going to lead to increased cost of production for the firm. Increased costs mean relatively less profits are going to be earned. Increased costs, decreased profits. The supply curve will shift to the left, indicating a decrease in supply. Decreased costs mean relatively more profits are going to be earned, and the supply curve is going to increase because this good or service becomes relatively more profitable to produce. Productivity. Productivity is a measure of output per unit of input. So what firms are using, the resources, the factors of production that they're using to produce the goods and services that they are producing. So inputs are going to include labour and capital, and output is typically measured in revenues or business components such as business inventories. Here we have a bakery. 2 bakers can bake 3 cakes. 2 bakers at $20 an hour can make 3 cakes per hour. That would mean the cost per cake, $40 divided by 3 cakes. Now, if we add a little capital, some technology into the bakery, suddenly our bakers can make quite a few more cakes. Here we have, with the new technology, the same bakers are not being paid extra. They're still being paid their wage, $20 an hour, but now they can output 8 cakes per hour. And if we look at the cost per cake, $40 divided by 8 cake, we know which cake is cheaper to make. So productivity has increased, and importantly, the cost per cake has fallen. Supply will increase as it's relatively now profitable. So productivity is really related to cost, and we can relate costs back to profitability, and supply is all about profitability. Make the links. Price of related goods. Now, most firms do not necessarily have to specialise in production of a single good. A farmer can choose to produce what he or she grows, and these types of goods have substitutes in production. So if the price of corn increases, for example, then the farmer is going to shift more resources to producing corn, dedicating fewer and fewer resources to the relatively less profitable wheat. So a farmer can grow corn, she can grow wheat. If the price of corn increases, our farmer are going to grow less wheat and devote more resources to growing corn because it's relatively more profitable. So the supply of corn will increase and the supply of wheat is going to decrease. So these types of related goods are termed competitive supply. These goods compete for the same factor resources in production. Joint supply is the other type of related goods, and this is the production of goods derived from a single product. So to make cheese, to manufacture cheese, to produce cheese, the cheese producer needs milk. If the price of milk increases, this is going to increase the cost of production to producing cheese, and the supply of cheese will decrease. Makes intuitive sense because we're relating it back to profitability. Climate and natural disasters are pretty straightforward. Climate change means that some regions around the world are getting less rain than they are used to historically. So, for example, California in the USA. And some areas are being subjected to less instances of rainfall, but the rain is much heavier. So the shorter monsoon season we're beginning to emerge in India. This makes agricultural production much more difficult. So a little bit of sunshine, a little bit of rain, good growing conditions for corn. Not enough rain, too much sunshine, not as much wheat can be supplied to the market. So the supply of wheat will decrease. The profitability of an industry. Now, if an industry is earning good profits, two things can occur. Existing firms can make capital investments to expand current production, or new firms may enter the industry. Again, relative profitability is the key. Why produce goods and services in industries where there's little profit to be made when businesses could shift their resources, establish themselves in new highly profitable industries? So we have farmers supplying wheat, and we have farmers supplying corn. If wheat becomes relatively more profitable, more farmers are going to change their production into wheat. The supply of wheat will increase and the supply of corn will decrease. So wheat becomes relatively more profitable. As the supply increases, corn becomes relatively less profitable. The supply will decrease. Taxes, the dreaded indirect taxes, makes goods or services that are being produced less profitable. So our definition for an indirect tax is a tax that's levied on goods and services rather than incomes or profits. And examples from around the world include sales taxes, GST, goods and service tax, and VAT, value-added tax. Indirect taxes increase the cost of production to firms, and we already know that when we increase the cost of production to firms, the goods or services become relatively less profitable.
Value-added tax, or VAT, is a tax on the added value of a good as it moves through the supply chain to the end consumer. In effect, the tax is levied on the gross margin at each point in the manufacturing, distribution, sales process. VAT is primarily used in the European Union. VAT is assessed and collected at each stage of the supply chain, in contrast to sales tax that is assessed and paid by the final consumer at the very end of the supply chain. Dulce is an expensive candy manufactured and sold in the country of Alexia. Alexia has a 10% value-added tax. Dulce's manufacturer buys the raw materials for $2 plus a VAT of 20 cents, payable to Alexia, for a total price of $2.20. The manufacturer then sells Dulce to a retailer for $5 plus a VAT of 50 cents for a total of $5.50. However, the manufacturer renders only 30 cents to Alexia, which is the total VAT at this point, minus the prior VAT charged by the raw material supplier. Note, the 30 cents also equals 10% of the manufacturer's gross margin of $3. Finally, the retailer sells Dulce to consumers for $10 plus a VAT of $1 for a total of $11. The retailer renders 50 cents to Alexia, which is the total VAT at this point, $1 minus the prior 50-cent VAT charged by the manufacturer. The 50 cents also represents 10% of the retailer's gross margin on Dulce.
Subsidies, a definition. This is a sum of money granted by the state to help an industry or business to keep the price of a good or service lower than the market can usually supply the good or service. Now, supply will increase with a subsidy because a subsidy will lower the cost of production, making supplying the good or service relatively more profitable. A subsidy will increase supply, and a withdrawal of a subsidy will decrease its supply. Right, we can model changes in supply, no problem at all, just like we could model changes in demand. Okay, so different prices here, $1 to $5, market supply. We have an increase in supply. So at those prices, more quantity is being supplied to the market. That results in an increase in supply, a shift of the supply curve to the right. More is being supplied to the market at each and every price. Quantity supplied versus supply. This is an important distinction. It's quite often assessed in IB economics. Okay, changes in the price of a good or service result in a change in the quantity of that good or service supplied. And that is a movement along the supply curve. Any other change in the determinants of supply result in actual changes in supply, and the supply curve is going to shift.
In the supply curve, when price increases from $2 to $4, quantity increases from 10 to 20. From $4 to $6, quantity increases from 20 to 30. The dot just moves along this curve. In econ speak, this movement is called change in quantity supplied. When price changes, we say there's a change in quantity supplied. Remember, there are other factors affecting supply as well. For instance, when price of eggs increases, producing cakes gets more expensive. We'll bake fewer cakes at every price. At $2, at $4, at $6, at every price. So, the entire supply curve shifts to the left. In econ speak, we say this is a decrease in supply. What if price of eggs decreases? The cost of baking cakes decreases. Profits increase. So bake more cakes. Supply increases. So the supply curve shifts right. Let's add graphs into the summary. When price increases, quantity supplied increases. It's a movement up the supply curve. When price decreases, quantity supplied decreases. It's a movement down the supply curve. When any of these non-price factors change in respective directions, supply increases. So the supply curve shifts right. When these factors change the other way, supply decreases. So supply curve shifts left. So far, we have been talking about individual supply. How do we derive the market supply? In other words, how many cakes can the market supply? If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe. Next up,